One of the simplest and probably the most common type of corruption involving police officers is one that some of you may have witnessed yourselves. I'm referring to the acceptance of gratuities. We see this commonly when police officers are given discounts on their meals or a free cup of coffee. This might not strike the average person as corruption at first glance, because the phrase police corruption usually conjures up images of taking payoffs from criminals or covering up a murder scene. But depending on the circumstances and the intent, taking gratuities from the public does qualify as corruption. There are strong arguments for and against the acceptance of gratuities. Michael White argues that accepting gratuities helps to strengthen the positive bond between the police and the community. When an officer takes a free meal from a store owner, this creates a positive connection between the officer and the owner, leaving them feeling that they've had a relationship. And this kind of relationship with the public usually has positive outcomes for the police, because now that citizen feels that they can approach the officer if they ever have any concerns. Another argument that Michael White makes is that gratuities are simply a friendly gesture given with no expectations of anything in return. This argument is true as long as the person given the gratuity is doing it without expecting any favors from the officers they come in contact with. The problem is that officers have no way of knowing if a free cup of coffee is being given with the expectation of the officer looking the other way in the future or doing them a favor. Michael White also argues that if gratuities are banned, it gives the impression that an officer can't tell the difference between a friendly gesture and a bribe. A bribe is something that is given to an officer in exchange for the officer doing something that would require him to grossly neglect his duties as an officer of the law. And according to John Kleinig, because a bribe is offered to deflect an officer from doing his duty, the inducement will need to be large enough to make the corruption worth it. And gratuities are usually small tokens of appreciation, like a free cup of coffee, so due to the nature of a bribe, you could argue that a cup of coffee or a free meal isn't going to be significant enough for an officer to neglect his duties. And accepting gratuities can also prove to be a bad thing as well. Michael White says that taking gratuities, even the small ones, can create a sense of obligation for the officer to reciprocate, because when somebody gives us a gift, we feel that we need to give something back to them as a sign of our appreciation. And when this happens on a regular basis, like when an officer continues taking free cups of coffee, a bond is then formed between the officer and the store owner. And Brandon Del Pozo argues that there is more going on during this exchange. When the exchange is repeated over time, the officer becomes naturally reluctant to make problems for this person, maybe more inclined to give this person or their immediate family preferential treatment if they're ever in violation of the law at some point. And according to this theory, when an officer sees a citizen that they have a relationship with, they'll be less likely to take action and therefore neglecting their duties. And this qualifies as corruption. Stephen Coleman also argues that accepting gratuities can lead to a slippery slope that would lead to future corruption, larger corruption in the future, like taking bribes. Because when you take a free gratuity, it shows that there's a willingness to be corrupted, and it's removed any reason for objecting to more serious forms of corruption in the future. This means that when an officer takes a small gratuity, he's saying that he's willing to accept gratuities, and this can lead to possible corruption in the future. James Ruiz also argues that taking gratuities is simply unprofessional. Police officers consider themselves professionals, much like doctors, lawyers, and teachers consider themselves professionals. So if an officer is going to conduct himself by being professional and those standards, that would include not taking gratuities from the public, much like doctors and lawyers don't take gratuities from the public. The acceptance of gratuities by police officers is one of the most common forms of corruption an officer can engage in, and it's also the easiest one to justify. When you accept a gratuity, the officer builds a connection with the public, and they're also seen as a simple, friendly gesture with no intentions of reciprocation by the officer. These appear to be the most popular justifications for accepting gratuities. It may be hard to view an officer as being corrupt because they accepted a free cup of coffee, but it still qualifies as corruption due to the preferential treatment that they're receiving. It can lead officers to providing favorable treatment to those who provide free services, and can be a catalyst for future crimes like bribery. And to avoid these types of issues, police departments should probably think about banning the acceptance of gratuities.